The iron spoke first, the long, slow complaint of old iron as she drew the stone door back on its hinges in the blue dark before any bird had thought to wake, and the sound carried down the frozen hollow the way a sound will carry over ground gone too cold to hold it. Out past the black rows of the killed orchards and the split root pits and the little useless fires that were warming no one, and it reached the men at her gate before the light did. They had come up the hollow in the worst cold anyone then living could remember, in the 9th week of a freeze that had shut the creek to its bed and burst the valley's stored potatoes to black water in their clamps and taken the seed away with them, and now they stood in a line at the mouth of the cleared land with their hats held in their 2 hands. They were the same men. That was the thing a stranger would not have known to look at them, that these were the same men, the same 40-odd households of the Coldwater Bottoms, the same hands that had slapped their own knees raw on the courthouse steps 3 winters gone. She stood in the cellar mouth in her dead husband's coat, the one she had turned once and mended twice, with a barn lantern hung on the iron above her, and a stub of pencil warmed in her fist, and the tally book she carried everywhere. And before she gave out a single potato to a single one of them, she counted them, because she counted everything, and she wrote the number at the head of a clean page, the way a person writes down a thing they mean to keep. 31 at the gate. More were coming down off the ridge in the dark with lanterns of their own, so that the hollow held a slow river of little lights, and she wrote that too, and she did not say anything to them yet, and her not saying anything was the loudest thing on that hillside. She had bought the whole of it for $11.40. The 60 acres they were standing on, the 60 acres of the old Ordway place that no grown man in the valley had set a boot inside of in 11 years. The ground they had all agreed among themselves was dead and cursed and good for snakes and nothing, she had taken at the sheriff's sale for $11.40, which was the whole of the back taxes, and not 1 cent past them, because there had been no one in the county fool enough to bid against her. 3 winters back, on those same courthouse steps, when the sheriff had cried the Ordway 60 a first time and a second time and a third and gotten silence, and then one thin woman's raised hand, the men now standing bareheaded at her gate had laughed until they had to catch the rail to keep their feet. Behind her, down 7 stone steps cut into the earth by hands 2 generations in their graves, in a dry, cold dark that had never once in all its years gone down to freezing, the old Ordway cellar held what it held. And what it held was the whole reason the line at her gate was a line of the living and not a row of the soon dead, and the reason those hats had come off, and the reason a woman they had pitied worse than they had ever scorned her was about to keep the entire valley alive through to the thaw. But the how of that, and the why of it, and how a stone door came to be waiting under 60 acres of thorn, where every man there would have sworn on his mother there was nothing but cane and copperheads and ruin, is a thing that has to be told from its start, and told slow, because it was done slow, and there is no other honest way to lay it down. Set that door in your mind and leave it shut a while. A stone door, 7 steps down, banked all around in earth, with a name and a year cut into the lintel over it under the moss. It had been there the whole time, the whole 11 years and the 2 long lifetimes before them, patient as a thing that has nowhere it needs to be, holding its cold and its dark and its shelves, waiting the way stone waits, which is to say without any waiting in it at all, only the being there year on year on year, while the thorn grew up over it and the county forgot it and the men laughed on the steps. Nobody knew it was down there, not the sheriff who cried the sale, and not the men who would not bid, and not the smooth man in the good gray coat who would come later with his papers and his soft regret. Not even she knew, the morning she raised her hand and spent her $11.40. What she had, that morning, was 3 donkeys and a debt at the mercantile, and a thing an old man had said to her that she had not yet earned the right to understand. The door would have to wait to be found. It was good at waiting. It had had practice. Understand what a room like that is and why it mattered, because everything turns on it in the end. It was a room of cold that never changed its mind, cut into the side of the hill by people who had learned in the hardest school there is that the earth a few feet down keeps one steady temper all the year round, cool against the killing heat of an August that wilts the corn in the row, and, far more to the purpose, warm against the killing cold of a February that can split a standing oak with a sound like a gun. That was the whole quiet art of it, an art older than the county and older than the country. And the first Ordway had built it into the hill the way his own grandfather had built one across the water, banked deep and roofed in stone, and floored in laid flag worn smooth. and it had held the family's winters sound for 2 generations before the family failed. And then it had gone on holding its cold faithfully in the dark for 11 years more, with nothing left to keep, and no one left to keep it for. Because a thing built true does not know how to quit, and will do its work in an empty house until the house comes down over it. There were shelves cut into the living stone, and there was, though I will not tell you yet what it was, one small forgotten store still standing on those shelves the whole time, kept sound and sweet across all the empty years by that unchanging cold, waiting under the thorn for a hand to come down the 7 steps and carry it up into the light. Hold that in your mind too. It is the center of the whole thing, and it will keep, the way it had already kept. She had walked over it and not known. The donkeys had walked over it. The oxen that broke a leg had come within a yard of it. A great hoof going down into a hollow that a flat briar field has no business holding, which was the cellar's own vent breathing up through the mat of root. And the man had cursed his luck and shot his ox and never once stood there wondering what makes a hole in level ground. That is how close a buried thing can lie to the very men who will one day beg for it and stay lost. Because it does not call out, and it does not shine, and it will not be hurried, and it looks, to a man in a hurry, exactly like a low place in the cane where a burned house used to be. And if a man had stood on the courthouse steps that bright cold morning of the sale and told the laughing crowd that under the worthless 60 they would not bid $11 on, there was a stone room that would one day stand between the whole valley and starvation, they would have laughed the harder, and laughed at him, and been right to by every measure they owned, because there was no way on earth to know it, and nothing to point to but thorn. That is the nature of a buried thing. It is worth nothing and less than nothing right up until the hour it is worth everything, and the whole long distance between those 2 prices is patience. And nobody in that valley knew how to price patience, because it does not shout, and it does not shine, and it asks for nothing and it looks. To a hurried and a proud and a laughing people, exactly like doing nothing at all. Now go back, because that is where the truth of it lives. Back before the killing winter, and before the cellar, and before the line at the gate. Back to a girl of 22 with nothing and no one, in the 2nd spring after they put her husband in the ground. Nella Hume had been widowed at 21 when the black fever went through the bottoms and took the strong before it bothered with the weak. And it took Corin Hume in 9 days and left her his name and his coat, and his half share of a rented 40 that his brother took back the same month the ground settled over him. She had owned, when the counting was done and the brother had come for what he said was his, exactly one thing of her own, and it was a book. It was a school copybook with a marbled cover, gone soft as cloth at the corners, in which she had since she was a child written down the things she saw, the weather and the prices and who owed what to whom, and which cow had thrown which calf in which field, not because anyone had asked her to, and not because it did her any good, but because a thing written down was a thing that could not lie to you later, and she had learned young that people would lie to you later. Set beside that book, the rest of her inventory was quickly told. She had the turned coat. She had a pair of her husband's boots stuffed at the toes with wool so they would answer to her feet. She had a debt of $9 at Ordway's Mercantile against flour and salt and lamp oil, which she paid down a dime and a quarter at a time, by taking in wash, and by hoeing other women's gardens on halves. She had a straw tick, a good knife, a whetstone, a hymn book she could not read the notes of and sang from anyway, and a lease she did not have on any acre of ground on the round earth. She slept that 2nd spring in the loft of a widow named Sab who let her the space for the milking and the wood, and she was, by every account the valley kept of such things, a woman with no money, and no standing, and no name that was hers and not a dead man's. She was the sort of young woman a town looks at and lowers its voice about. And she counted. Under all of it, behind the washwater and the borrowed loft and the dead man's boots, she counted, and she remembered, and she wrote it down. What she owned besides the book, though nobody thought to put it in the ledger of her, was 3 donkeys, and how she came to have them is the whole hinge of the thing. There was an old man at the far ragged edge of the bottoms, down where the good land quit and the wet ground and the brush began. A foreigner who had come from across the water so long before that the story of how had worn smooth and dropped out of telling, and his name in the mouths of the valley was Old Petar and nothing after it. He kept donkeys. He had always kept donkeys, 5 or 6 of the small gray sort with the cross marked dark across their shoulders, on a scrap of ground so poor and so grown up in briar that the men who farmed the good bottoms did not count him a farmer at all, but a kind of weather that happened down at the edge, And they said he talked to the animals and let them into his house in the cold, and they left him alone the way you leave alone a thing that has nothing you want. He was the only creature in the valley poorer than Nella Hume, and the first spring she was widowed, she walked down to his place to see about a day's work, and he had no money to pay her and told her so plainly, and instead he showed her his donkeys, and he showed her his ground. His ground was the thing. It was a half-acre a man could stand in the middle of and see it had been thorn once, briar 10 feet high once, the same cane that swallowed the whole valley's fencerows, and it was not thorn now. It was clean black dirt in beds, and squash running over it, and a stand of corn better than the bottoms grew, and along the edges the briar still stood in a green wall, but the wall was retreating, foot by foot, year by year, and along the front of it, his little gray donkeys stood in a movable pen of poles and browsed the wall down. They ate it. They ate the tender new cane as fast as the briar could throw it, all the long green months, and they ate it again where it tried again, and their hooves broke the crowns, and their manure fattened the ground the thorn had guarded, and where they had been, a season or two behind them, was garden. Nella Hume stood at the edge of old Petar's half-acre for the better part of an hour, and she did not say much, but she took out her book and she began to write. The valley had already decided about her, and it had decided the harder of the two things a valley can decide about a young woman alone, which is not that she was bad but that she was pitiable, and pity is a colder bed to lie in than scorn, because scorn you can stand up against and pity only presses you down. The women were kind to her in the particular way that is worse than unkindness, saving her the bruised apples and the heel of the bread, and speaking softly when she came near, as though loud words might break her, and the men touched their hats and looked past her, and the whole of it added up to a verdict, quietly entered, that here was a poor thing the fever had ruined, a girl who would take in wash until she was old, and be buried out of somebody's charity, and there was nothing to be done for such a case but be gentle with it. They had folded her up and put her away, and the one thing they could not see, because it made no sound and asked for nothing and never once argued back, was that she was watching all of them. She was watching the ground, and the weather, and the prices, and the way old Petar's briar wall gave up its feet to a patient mouth, and she was writing it all in a marbled book, and a woman who is writing everything down is not being ruined. She is taking inventory. There is a great difference, and the valley did not know to price it. Pity has a way of arranging itself into small kindnesses that are really small burials, and the valley buried Nella Hume in them a little deeper with every passing season. The Sab widow saved her the cracked eggs and the heel of the loaf. The mercantile let her $9 debt ride without a word, which sounds like mercy and sits in the chest like a swallowed stone, because a debt no one will trouble you to pay is a debt no one believes you will ever grow large enough to clear. At the meeting house, the women made her room on the bench with a softness that said, without one word in it, "Poor thing, poor young thing," and the men asked after her the careful way you ask after the sick, and not one of them, not the kindest of them and not the coldest, ever once asked her what she thought about anything at all, because a thing you have decided is ruined is a thing you quietly stop asking questions of. She let them. She did not argue against the verdict, because she had learned in the 2 hardest years a woman can spend that you do not talk a valley out of a thing it has settled among itself, you only outlast it, and to outlast a thing, you must first be counting it, patiently, from the inside, day by day, and she was counting. That was the whole of what they could not see and never thought to price. While they were saving her the bruised apples she was learning by heart the way the frost sat a full 2 weeks later up her hollow, then down in the wet bottoms, and which fields drowned in a rainy year, and which shed the water and drained, and what a bushel of sound seed fetched at the mill in a good spring, and what it fetched in a starving one, and the exact retreating rate of old Petar's briar wall, so many feet of it a year, to so many head of donkey, and she set it all down in the marbled book in a hand so small and even it might have been printed, not because a line of it did her the least good that year or the next, but because a woman who writes down the world entire is a woman assembling, in secret and in the plainest sight both, the one weapon a poor person is ever let to carry, which is knowing exactly how things are, while everyone around her makes do with how they merely seem. They saw a widow bent over a washtub. They did not see the ledger filling behind her eyes. That is the difference a valley cannot price. The difference between a woman being ruined and a woman taking inventory. And it is the whole of this story folded into a single line. They pitied the inventory. They ought to have been afraid of it. The Ordway 60 was the worst ground in the county, and it had not started that way, and the story of how it fell is the story of why no one would touch it. 2 generations back, the first Ordway had come up the hollow when the hollow was timber and had cleared the 60 by hand and by fire and by ox over the better part of 30 years, and had built a stone house and a stone cellar and set out an orchard of 40 apple trees and made of that hollow the finest small farm above the bottoms, and the town that grew around his mill down at the creek took the family's name and kept it. Then the good ground did what good ground does to families that forget to be afraid of it. A grandson mortgaged the 60 in a bad year against a note he was sure the next year would clear, and the next year came in wet, and the one after it wetter. And in a run of wet years, the fence rows went to Blackberry the way fence rows will, and the briar walked out of the fence rows into the fallow, and out of the fallow into the orchard. And the last Ordway man on the place took the coughing sickness into his chest and could not swing a blade against it, and coughed for 2 winters and died. And his widow looked at 60 acres closing over her like water, and gave it up and went to her people down the river, and took her one small son with her. The stone house burned the next summer in a dry lightning storm with no one there to beat the sparks out. The county took the ground for the taxes, and then it simply sat. It sat for 11 years, and in 11 years the Blackberry did to the Ordway 60 what it had spent a generation practicing on the fence rows, and it took the whole of it. Every acre, cane on cane on cane, until the briar stood higher than a man on a horse, and so thick a running dog would turn back from it, and the burned house went under, and the orchard went under, and the stone cellar with its stone door went under. 7 steps of dark sealed over in a mat of root and thorn, so complete that a person could have stood on the very lintel and known nothing beneath his feet but a low place in the briar. And men had tried it. That was the part the valley told with a kind of pride, the way men will tell you the ways a thing has beaten better men than you. A Renton had brought a breaking plow and 2 yoke of oxen, and the plow would not bite through the mat of roots but rode up over it, and one of his oxen put a leg down a hole that had no business being there in the middle of a briar field and broke it, and had to be shot, and Renton left the 60 swearing. Others had burned it, and fire is the fool's answer to Blackberry, because fire takes the top and scarifies the seed and wakes 10 crowns where it killed 1. And the 60 came back from every burning blacker and thicker than before. Men had gone in with brush hooks and cleared a rod in a day with their hands running blood, and come back in a week to find the rod closed behind them like water closing over a stone. So the valley agreed, and it was an easy thing to agree, that the Ordway 60 was dead ground and cursed ground, and worth exactly the back taxes owed on it, which was to say worth nothing, because no man alive would pay the taxes for the right to be beaten by it. The sheriff cried it on a bright cold morning in the 3rd autumn of Nella Hume's widowhood, on the courthouse steps at the crossroads, with maybe 60 people about on other business, and a dozen come to watch the joke of it. And he cried the Ordway 60 for the taxes owed, $11.40, and asked for a bid, and got a silence with a snicker running under it. He cried it a second time, and named the sum again, and a man in the crowd said something low that set the others laughing, about who would pay good money to buy a fight with the devil's own briar patch. He cried it the 3rd time, $11.40, going once, and into that 3rd silence, Nella Hume raised her hand. She had the money in coin, counted, in a twist of cloth in her fist. She had saved it 10.25 at a time out of washwater and half shares over 2 years, the same slow way she paid the mercantile, and she laid it in the sheriff's hand, and signed the book, and took her certificate, and folded it once along a crease she meant to keep, and the courthouse steps came apart in laughter around her like a barn coming down. Men laughed until they wept. A woman laughed with a hand over her mouth as though even she knew it was cruel and could not stop. And Nella Hume put her certificate inside her coat against her ribs, and walked down through the middle of them with her chin held level, not high and not low, only level, and she said nothing, and her saying nothing was an answer they did not know how to hear. At the foot of the steps, old Petar was waiting, because he had walked the 4 miles up from the edge of the bottoms to see her do it, having been the one who told her the 60 would come up for the taxes, and the one who had sold her, for $1, the use of 3 of his donkeys, and their increase for as long as she should need them. He did not laugh. He was the only soul at the crossroads that morning who did not laugh. He took her hand, the one that had held the coin, and he turned it over so the palm was up, and he set into the palm 1 blackberry that he had carried up the hollow in a bit of cloth. a single dark blackberry from his own retreating wall, and he closed her fingers over it with both of his old hands. And he said the thing that she would carry the rest of her long life and hand on at the end of it. "Good ground hides under the thorn," he said, "and it opens for no blade and no fire, only for a patient mouth and the years." That was all he said. Then he let go of her hand and turned and started the 4 miles home, and she stood at the foot of the steps with a crushed blackberry staining her closed palm, and did not yet understand that she had just been handed the whole of it, the method and the meaning and the ending, in 20-odd plain words by a man the valley counted as weather. The method was no secret and no trick, and that was the beauty of it, and the reason no proud man had ever stooped to try it. She could not fight the 60, and she did not try to fight it. She fenced a first small piece of the briar wall at the near edge with movable pens of poles the way old Petar had shown her, no more than a 1/4 acre penned at a time, and she put the 3 donkeys into it, and the donkeys did what donkeys have done since there were donkeys, which is eat, steadily and without hurry, and without any notion that the work was hard or the odds were long, because a donkey keeps no ledger of the impossible. They stripped the tender green cane as fast as the briar could push it. In the spring, when the new growth is soft and sweet, and full of the sugar the plant has drawn up out of its deep roots to build the year's wall, and every mouthful of that new cane was a withdrawal from the root that the root could not get back, and the briar, robbed of its green all through the growing months, robbed again the moment it tried again, spent itself down to nothing the way a man spends himself down who is made to run and never allowed to eat. It took a season to break a 1/4 acre to bare cane and broken crown. It took the donkey's hooves through a wet autumn to trample the crowns to rot, and it took their manure and the mat of dead cane going soft to feed the freed dirt. And then she moved the pens a 1/4 acre on and began again. And where they had been she came behind with a mattock and a hoe, and turned in the rot and put in potatoes. Because the ground a blackberry has guarded for 11 years is ground a blackberry has been feeding for 11 years. The richest black dirt in the county, only waiting under the thorn for a patient mouth to open it. And she measured all of it, every foot, in the marbled book. She wrote the day she moved each pen, and the day the first green broke, and the day she turned the rot under, and the weight of what came off each freed 1/4 acre in the fall, and the book filled, and she started a second book, and the seasons went over the hollow, the slow way seasons go. In the first summer she cleared and cropped a single acre, and the valley laughed a second time, gentler now, the laugh you laugh at a thing you have decided is harmless. In the second summer the 3 donkeys had become 5, and she cleared and cropped better than 3 acres, and the laugh went quieter still, and 1 or 2 of the men rode up the hollow on a Sunday to look, and rode down not laughing at all, and did not say what they had seen. By the 3rd spring there were 9 donkeys working the wall, born to the work and knowing nothing else, and Nella Hume had 11 acres of the Ordway 60 in clean black beds throwing corn and potatoes and squash and beans, and a garden the equal of any in the bottoms, and she had begun, quietly, to sell a little at the mill and to lay a great deal by, and she was no longer a joke, and she had become instead the far more dangerous thing, which is a question a valley cannot answer. It was in the 3rd spring that the ground gave up the first thing it could not take back, and it gave it up to the donkeys, as it had given up everything. She had moved the pens up onto a low rise near the center of the 60, where the briar grew strangest, in a great humped mound taller than the rest, and the donkeys ate the rise down through a wet march, and one gray morning she came up with the mattock to turn the cleared ground, and her tool struck stone. Not a stone. Stone cut square and laid true. A broad flat lintel of dressed limestone with moss in the letters of it. And below it, when she had cleared the thorn root away with her hands, through the whole of that day, a stone door set in a stone frame, banked in earth, 7 steps going down into a cold, that came up out of the dark against her face like breath. She stood a long time before she opened it. The name cut in the lintel was Ordway, and the year under the name was a year before her mother was born, and when she drew the door back on its groaning iron, and carried the lantern down the 7 steps, she found a room of dry, cold stone, with shelving cut into the walls, and on the shelves, gone leathery and small and light as paper but not rotted, never once frozen, kept by the deep, unchanging cold of the earth and the stone, the last stores the last Ordway woman had laid by before she gave up and went down the river, a row of withered apples and a bin of shrunken seed potatoes with their pale eyes reaching in the dark toward a spring that had never come. She took up one of the old seed potatoes and turned it in the lantern light, and understood that she was holding a thing that had waited 11 years in the ground to be planted. And she carried the whole bin up into the light. And that spring she put the old Ordway stalk into the old Ordway ground. And it came up hardy and strong and strange. An old kind of potato bred for a hard place and forgotten, and she saved every eye of it, and told no one what was down the 7 steps, and wrote it in her book. The man in the good gray coat came the summer after, when the 60 had begun to be a word in the county, and he came the way that kind of man always comes, not as a thief but as a friend, riding a good horse up the hollow track that the donkey's work had opened, and he sat the horse a while at the edge of her clearing, and looked at 11 acres of black beds where there had been thorn, and then he got down and took off his hat to her, and told her his name was Cade and that he was sorry to trouble a busy woman. He was well-dressed and well-spoken, and his regret was the smoothest thing about him, and he had, he said, a small sad matter of business, that he would rather not have brought, but that his conscience would not let him leave. And he took from a leather case a paper, an old deed of trust against the Ordway place, a note the last Ordway man had signed in his bad year and never cleared, a lien for a sum that had grown with its interest into more money than Nella Hume had ever seen named on one line. He held it out to her gently. He was grieved, he said, truly grieved, to be the one to tell her that the ground she had put her strong young years into was encumbered, that this old note stood against the title, that a clever woman such as himself could see she plainly was, would understand that her sheriff's certificate did not clear a debt of this kind, and that rather than see her ruined by the courts, rather than watch her turned off the ground with nothing after all her labor, he was prepared to be generous. He would buy her out. He would pay her cash, a fair sum, a kind sum, this very afternoon, and take the trouble of the lien onto his own shoulders, and she could go with money in her hand, and no cloud over her name. He said a great many words. He was a man who believed his words were his strength, and he spent them freely, and he warned her 3 separate gentle ways of the ruin that waited for her if she was too proud to be helped. She let him talk. She had learned young that a certain kind of man will, if you only keep still and let him, walk the whole distance to the edge of his own pit and hand you the shovel, and she kept still. And near the end of it, sure of her silence and mistaking it for the silence of a woman with no answer, Mr. Cade made his one mistake. The mistake his kind makes because they cannot in the end resist letting you know how much they know. He folded his old note back into its case and said, warmly, that he had watched that ground come clear these 3 years with real admiration, that he had marked the day she took it, that he had stood at the back of the courthouse steps the morning she paid her $11.40 for it, and had thought even then that there was more sense under that plain bonnet than the fools around her could see. He smiled when he said it. He meant it for a kindness. And Nella Hume, who had stood at those steps and been laughed at and had, before she walked down through the laughter, done the thing she always did and written down what she saw, looked at him for the first time full in the face and said 4 words. I wrote you down. She went into the house and came back with the marbled book and the second book and a flat tin box, and she did not raise her voice, because the fact did not need her voice. The fact was strong enough to stand on its own bare feet. She opened the first book to the page of the sale, 3 winters old, in her own small hand, and there among the weather and the count of the crowd was the line she had set down that morning, without knowing why, only because she wrote everything. A man in a good gray coat at the back of the steps who did not raise his hand. There was the date beside it. From the tin box she took the sheriff's certificate folded on its old crease, and the sheriff's deed that had followed it, recorded at the courthouse a year and a day after the sale, when the redemption had run out and no soul had come to redeem, dated and stamped by the clerk, and she laid it in the light. She took out the county paper of that autumn with the sale printed in it, the legal notice she had clipped and kept, and in the body of that notice, printed for all the world including a man in a gray coat to read, was the Ordway place and the taxes owed and the plain public statement that the sale would pass the title and that any lien or claim not redeemed within the year and the day would be forever barred. She had kept it all. A tax sale, run clean and cried 3 times and printed in the paper, and left open a year and a day, takes the ground free of the old debts upon it, and every debt is given its year to come forward and be paid or be lost. And Mr. Cade's old note had had its year, and its year had passed, and he had been there at the steps and seen it, cried, and read it in the paper, and let the year run out without paying $1 to redeem, because he had believed, like all of them, that the 60 was worthless and not worth the taxes, and had only come to want it after a woman and 9 donkeys made it worth wanting. He had proved with his own patient watching that the ground had value, and he had lost his claim to it in the same breath. And it was all there in the record, dated, printed, folded on its crease. She said none of that. She only laid the papers down in order and stood back and let him read them, and she said the second of her short sentences, which was the whole of her argument. "The year is up." Mr. Cade read the papers. He was not a stupid man, which was the one thing to be said for him, and a stupid man might have blustered, but he saw in about a minute and a half of reading that a poor young woman who wrote down the color of a stranger's coat at a tax sale 3 years before he needed it to matter was not a woman he was going to take anything from, and he folded his old worthless note back into its leather case with hands that had lost a little of their smoothness, and he put his hat back on, and he said, quite low, that he could see he had been misinformed, and he wished her a good harvest, in a voice that had all the sunshine gone out of it. And he got on his good horse and rode down the hollow, and he was gone from the county before the first frost, having found, men said afterward, business elsewhere. She never spoke his name again. She wrote one line in the book, the date and the words he came and he went, and she closed it, and that was the whole of the war, and no blood in it, and no shout, only a woman who had kept the record beating a man who had thought the record was his to make. Then came the winter that turned the joke all the way around, the winter the valley would date its lives from ever after, the year the deep freeze came down in the first week of December and did not lift for 9 weeks, and shut the cold water to its bed so a wagon could cross it, and killed the stock in the fields, and killed, worst of all, the seed. For the bottoms farmed the way the bottoms had always farmed, in shallow clamps and pits, potatoes and turnips banked under a foot of straw and earth, against an ordinary cold, and an ordinary cold was all any of them had ever had to answer, and this was not an ordinary cold. This cold went down through the straw, and down through the earth, and into the clamps, and froze the stored crop solid, and then, in the slow thaw between the freezes, rotted it to a black stinking water, so that one gray morning after another, a man of the bottoms would open his pit, expecting his family's winter, and his spring seed both, and find a hole full of poison, and stand there in the cold with nothing. 12 farms along the creek lost their whole store that way, and their seed with it, which was the crueler loss, because a family can beg its way through a hungry March, but a family with no seed potatoes cannot plant, and a valley that cannot plant in the spring is a valley that starves in the next winter, and not this one. They had food to worry about, and behind the food, cold and certain, they had the end of everything to worry about, because the seed was gone. The seed was not gone up the hollow. 7 steps down under 60 acres, in the old Ordway cellar of dressed stone banked deep in the earth, in the dry, unchanging cold that in 2 long lifetimes had never once gone to freezing, Nella Hume's stores sat sound and whole, better than 400 bushels of potatoes off the black beds the donkeys had opened, and among them kept separate and counted twice, the seed, the hardy old Ordway stock she had raised up out of that same cellar 3 springs gone and multiplied every year since, an old kind bred for a hard place by hands long dead, the one seed in the whole valley that this hard place could not kill. The killing winter that broke 12 farms could not find its way down her 7 stone steps. It rattled the iron door, and it lay 9 weeks on the 60 acres above, and it did not get in. Because the men who cut that cellar out of the earth 2 generations before had cut it to beat exactly this winter, and were in their graves and had beaten it anyway. And so the line formed at her gate in the blue dark, the same men, hats in their hands, and that is where this began, and now you know how they came to be standing there, and there is only the end of it left to tell. She did not give it away, and she did not gouge them, and the difference between those 2 things is the whole measure of what she had become. A foolish woman, or a soft one, would have flung the cellar open and handed out her 400 bushels for the asking, and been empty and adored by March, and no better than any of them by the next winter, and Nella Hume was not soft, and had not been soft since the fever, and she had not opened 60 acres of thorn, with a patient mouth over 4 hard years, to play the fool at the end of it. She set a price, and she set it fair. A true price, and not a low one. The going price of sound seed in a bad year, and not a penny of it charity. Because charity would have shamed them, and a fair price let them keep their backs straight. And to the men who had the cash she sold for cash, and wrote it in the book. And to the men who had nothing, The 12 families off the ruined creek farms with empty pits and empty hands and children behind them. She did the thing that was the real victory, the thing the money was never the point of. She weighed out their seed by the light of the lantern and set it in their sacks and closed the book on the dead of it with a line and a handshake, seed now against a share at harvest, a fair share and a plain one, no paper and no lien and no interest creeping in the dark, only her hand in a man's hand at the cellar mouth, and both their names in the marbled book, so that every ruined farm in the bottoms had seed to put in the ground come spring, and the valley that could not have planted itself out of the old Ordway cellar, one sack and one handshake at a time, all through the gray end of that winter. And she stood at the cellar mouth in her dead husband's turned coat with the lantern on the iron above her and the tally book open on her arm, and she counted them as they came, and wrote each name and each weight, 31, and then 40, and then all of them, and she gave them good morning and little else, because there was nothing to say that the seed did not say better. And the men who had laughed until they wept on the courthouse steps took off their hats to her one after another in the cold, and could not meet her eye, not out of any hardness in her, for there was none, but out of the particular shame of people who see all at once that they were wrong for years, and were wrong in the cruelest way, which is by pitying a thing that never once needed their pity. She did not gloat. It never crossed her to gloat. She only counted, and wrote, and weighed out seed, while behind her the stone door stood open on its cold dark, and the 60 acres lay white and cleared, and waiting for spring above the buried room that had saved them all. And down at the far fence, out past the lantern light where the last of the briar still stood along the margin the donkeys had not yet reached, the 9 gray donkeys worked in the dark at the wall as they had worked at it 4 years running, eating it down, patient and untroubled and sure, one bite and one season at a time. They give the last of that story out in different endings, the way a valley will, but all the endings closed, and closed well. Old Petar, who had walked 4 miles to watch her spend her $11.40, and had put a blackberry in her hand and told her the truth, did not die at the edge of the bottoms in the briar, as the valley had always assumed he would. She brought him up the hollow the spring after the killing winter, him and his last donkeys, and set him by her fire, and he lived out his years there warm, and fed with the sound of the working herd in the yard, and he died in a good bed in his 90th winter, with nothing owed and nothing lacking, content as a man gets to be, and she buried him on the rise above the cellar, where he could keep his eye, she said, on the wall coming down. The man in the gray coat was never seen in the county again, and was not much missed and left no mark, which is the ending that kind earns and the only punishment they truly feel. And there was a boy, the last of the Ordways, a grave, quiet child that the burned house and the lost ground and a dead father had left half an orphan down the river, and Nella Hume sent for him when the 60 was green again, and took him up the hollow and raised him on the ground his grandfather had cleared and his father had lost, and she taught him the whole of it, the donkeys and the seasons and the patient mouth, and she taught him to write it down, and he kept the ledger at her elbow through her long middle years grave beyond his age, and when he was a grown man, he cleared a briar hollow of his own 2 counties over, with the donkey's increase and the old Ordway seed, and did well, and taught his own children to keep the book. And she grew old up the hollow, Nella Hume, old and unhurried and content, on 60 acres of the best small farm above the bottoms, and the wall of thorn came all the way down at last and stayed down, and the stone cellar kept its cold through good winters and bad, and the book she wrote everything in filled a shelf and then a wall. And one autumn near the end of her, a girl came up the hollow track on foot with nothing, a thin young woman widowed early and pitied hard, and put away by a valley that had decided about her, come to see about a day's work, because she had heard the old woman up the 60 sometimes had it. And Nella Hume, who was by then the old woman up the 60, looked at her a long moment, and knew her the way you know a thing you have already been, and she did not offer her the day's work, not yet. She took the girl's hand instead, and turned it over so the palm was up, and she set into the open palm one small piece of a seed potato with a single pale eye in it, an eye out of the old Ordway stock that had waited 11 years in the dark to be planted, and had been planting the valley for 50 years since, and she closed the girl's cold fingers over it with both her old hands, and she said the thing that had been said to her at the foot of the courthouse steps a lifetime before, word for word, the way you hand on a thing you have proved with your whole life is true. Good ground hides under the thorn, she said, and it opens for no blade and no fire, only for a patient mouth and the years. Then she let go of the girl's hand, and the girl stood holding the closed fist of it, not yet understanding what she had been given, and out past them both in the falling light, along the last low line of briar at the far edge of the 60 that there would always be a little more of to eat. The donkeys had already started in on the wall, and went on eating it down in the dusk, unhurried and untroubled and sure, one bite and one season at a time, and going and going.